people are inundated with information these days, right? And our attention span is shorter than ever. So the fluffier you are, the easier it is to be dismissed.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our exclusive Nobody Studios live stream. I'm Sejal Thacker, and we're thrilled to have you here today as we explore how to build, sustain, and grow a powerful brand strategy and identity. And so at Nobody Studios, we've known from day one that our brand really defines our legacy. And so today we're going to be talking about what guides our brand strategies and how startups can navigate common pitfalls to stay competitive in this evolving market, right? And so I'm excited to welcome back our Chief Nobody, Mark McNally, and our Senior VP of Incubation and Strategic Advisor, Andy Walsh, to the show. It's great to have you both here.
Thanks, Sejal.
Thank you,
Look,
Sejal.
You've already got some fans, and we haven't even started talking yet. Thank you, Rob Nicola, for joining us. He said it's the rock stars. I'm just going to leave that message up there for a little while.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rob, for being so supportive and really bringing your positive vibes to the live stream. So let's just get started because this is a really important topic. And I want to jump in with really kind of exploring what sets Nobody Studios apart. So, Mark, I'll start off with you. Can you share some of the things that, when you were envisioning Nobody Studios and our brand strategy, what were some of the things that you wanted to make sure that we take into consideration?
Yeah, look, one of the things I always tell, I mentor startup founders and everybody else on is I just believe you have to understand what you stand for, and you also need to be clear what you're trying to accomplish. And that language should be so simple. It should be, easy to rattle off. It should be, tip of your tongue anytime someone wants to ask you what you're trying to accomplish and what you stand for. But I also believe you can't fake it. So again, I think there's a soul searching in the beginning of any kind of new code to make sure you really are. You're not conceiving of concepts or doing things that academically sound right, but you can just genuinely, passionately talk about them, right? And one of the things I always mentor people on is just start telling your story and tell it transparently. And I think that's one of the things that nobody did from the very beginning. I had a narrative on all the companies I've been a part of, venture-backed startups for the last 20-something years that led me to conclude certain things about how companies should be created and why I was passionate about that being the best way I could make an impact on the world and do something special with the second half of my career. And I can do that with my eyes closed because of my truth. And we said, well, okay, if we're going to build this kind of company, what are we going to stand for? What are some of the things that make us unique? And again, I'm proud that if you go back 4 years ago and watch any podcasts or you look at an old deck, it's basically the same story, right? Because we know exactly what we're trying to accomplish and what we're trying to stand for. And I think you get rewarded if you do that right. If you're clear, if it's really coming from a spot that is true and transparent and genuine, you get rewarded because down the road, I've had so many times where we talk to, a potential recruit or a new founder or investor or whatever, and we have a great first conversation, let's say, and they say, well, what's the next step? How can I get to know the organization more? And I just literally say, well, here's 20 great people you should talk to. Pick the ones that work best on your calendar or you're most intrigued by. Because I really know that they're going to go talk to other nobodies and they're going to hear a version of what I say. They're going to hear their unique backgrounds and their own perspectives. But when those people come back to say a follow-up call with me, I get rewarded with, wow, those are some of the coolest people I've ever spoken to. Like just good people, awesome backgrounds. They're all aligned in the vision of what we're trying to do here and what we stand for. And again, I think that's what a good brand strategy is, right? Now we're a venture studio, so we do lots of different companies. So it's a little bit different for us because our message is maybe broader. But one of the things we try to do with each one of our companies is say, the brand strategy, like what you stand for when you're actually trying to put that out in the market, it really needs to connect with people on what you stand for, what you're trying to accomplish, right? So you also shouldn't get too fluffy. It shouldn't be like, oh, this is a really great company. They're trying to be a good place to work at and make the world a better place. I don't know if you're doing routers or if you're doing AI or you're building, pumpkin pies, right? So I do think it's important at a young startup stage to truly embrace a brand that communicates clearly what you stand for because people are inundated with information these days, right? And our attention span is shorter than ever. So the fluffier you are, the easier it is to be dismissed. And we actually have gone through this with a couple of our own companies recently. Like we're really excited about Avalify is, tearing it up in the market in terms of automating IP analysis for startups and investments. But it was really easy again, with well intentions, it was really easy for that message to start saying, we de-risk investments. Well, that's actually not what Evalify does. Evalify looks at a very specific thing, which is intellectual property and patents, and says, in this overall concept, whether you're building it or you're investing in it, is there intellectual property risk you should know about? And you have to be comfortable with being that narrow in your messaging. And so people can look at that and go, oh, that's interesting. And it's been funny as we talk to customers, they'll say, man, we've been inundated with people who talk to us about evaluating investments and applying AI this and AI that. But IP is one of the things that we don't have our head around. We've never seen a solution for. And your message is so focused and your product is so focused. Like, we love this. It actually gets to speed of transaction, right? It adds velocity into your overall sales and conversion process. If you can just be really clear on who you're trying to be. And I'm a reformed, entrepreneur that loves to talk about big, broad visions. But I always tell the entrepreneur, focus on your narrow focus. Doesn't mean you can't grow over time. Doesn't mean you can't grow your overall, product set or features or different things you want to say to customers. But you do have to pick a very narrow focus so you can get traction in the market, resonate with your customers, and prove that market fit.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And I love everything you said, about the mission and core values being sort of fundamental part of the brand strategy. And so, Andy, as startups start to scale and they're growing, I think sometimes what we've seen is that they lose alignment with the mission or the core values in their brand strategy. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how, if you can elaborate on this and really provide some practical strategies for people that are listening in on how they can ensure their brand strategy really stays aligned with their mission and their core values.
Yeah, it's a good place to start, because I think in the early days of a startup, what you're trying to achieve is, I guess, get down on paper all the things that brought you together, but also the things that ultimately differentiate you. So if you're going out with a story and you have a competitor set, there's things about you that are at a human level to start with, but then also as a product and brand that will enable you to be unique and have this point of difference. But what it comes down to is very much around honesty. And Mark talked to that just before. It's like about you and as people in your business, what are the things that you actually stand for, and not just have this sort of fake almost or very contrived story that you feel that people are going to respond to, because that becomes disingenuous, right? You're not able to sustain that. It's like the equivalent of telling a lie versus telling the truth. If you tell the truth, you just have to remember what you actually did. If you tell a lie, you got to remember the story that you made up and repeat that the same way every time. So I think if you go back to something really practical like that as an example, your ability to be able to bring that to life is much easier. So I always start with the purpose, which is your why, in the sense of ultimately, like, why are you doing what you're doing? Like, how do you build relationships? So if you look at like something really simple, like the golden circle, which is a nice way to look at starting from the inside out with your why. And that sort of foundationally informs every story that you'll ultimately tell. And it could be internal culture. And Sage, we've talked a lot about this even on one of these broadcasts before. It's like, how does your culture and how you communicate, how you tell stories internally actually get replicated externally too? And in the startup business, we're used to having failures, right? Like, it's things that you test and you learn. And a failure doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. But being honest in communication about where you're at in your journey, building relationships with other people, and then how those relationships build bonds. Because ultimately, at that early stage, what you're trying to do is build trust. And vulnerability is the most beautiful way to build trust. So if you can crack the why and use that as a foundation to build off with everything that you're doing, it's a simple way to keep people aligned to that. If you manifest that culture internally, you tell that story, and then you are keeping it simple. It can't be complex as far as a full 30-page brand strategy at that stage. You don't even know who you are. Like, you need customer feedback. You need to understand, if your business didn't exist tomorrow, like, what would they do? And like, how important is that business to them? It's a good question to tack in there. So I think being aligned with your values internally is all around purpose. And that is the North Star of what drives your business forward.
Yeah, and from the culture perspective, I completely resonate with everything. I think it's so important to clearly define your mission and core values and make sure that everybody understands it, right? From the newest person in the team to the founders, everybody should understand and really embody those values. And I think then the next step is obviously where I want to ask you next, Andy, is integrating these values into the company culture, right? That means every decision, whether it's product development or customer service, should reflect the core principles, right? But one thing you mentioned during our prep, you made an interesting point between the interplay between brand strategy, creative strategy, and marketing strategy, and how they can impact the positioning in the market. So can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, for sure. So the brand strategy, which we sort of covered before, is very much sort of who we are, and I always talk like very sort of forthrightly so about like the way that a brand is very human like. There's things between the three of us that we know instinctively about who we are and what we stand for because we're consistent with that. But we also have, emotional fluctuations. We have things that change in our life, and a brand should be the same way, right? Like you have good days and bad days, and I think that the word being human is probably taking it too far because it gets overused, I think, as far as a brand being human. But what that means as far as like what you stand for and sort of who you are should be consistent. But like for me personally, I've lived in different places. I've had different passions and hobbies. So I evolve, and people, are used to that with me and with other people around them. That's the great thing about life is that we change. And I think with a brand, it can do the same thing as far as what you define of who you are. You might, this year and for the next few years be a massive football fan. And then all of a sudden you discover another sport you've never seen before. And all of a sudden you have a passion for that. And I think from a brand perspective, it's very much understanding your audience and the things that they're into and finding that connection. And that can change over time. So I think at the brand level, it's very much the who. At a creative strategy, it's sort of like it's taking who you are and finding the right way to articulate that. And like watching these a lot, like Mark is a great storyteller. And I think like for him, that's his version of creative strategy, right? It's like, what is your message? Like, how do you articulate the things that are about you in a way that actually translate to other people? So I know who Mark is. And then I'll hear Mark tell a story, and it connects me with him in a way because I relate to it. Like there's a big part of empathy which goes into storytelling too. There's a way that you connect by learning. And Mark in that essence is very much vulnerable, which is one of the things that I respect about him. And the conversations we have, we're laughing before the call, like we've got this really great sort of dynamic between the two of us now, and it's forged around sort of, taking the piss out of each other a little bit in the sense of the things that we know each other because we can, but there's a level of trust that goes into that. So stories is a great way to do that. So that's your creative strategy. It's like, what is our story and how do we sort of tell others who we are in a way that's not like, I'm Andy, I love music, and, seeing live music, it's a bit one-dimensional. Whereas if I told you about a live music show that I went to recently and talked about the experience, the people that were there, like what sort of, I guess, emotion it created for me, that connects with you in a much more profound way than just telling you that that's what my sort of passions are. So going back to your values, I think that that's sort of a really nice way to do that, because what you're doing is sort of manifesting your internal values in a way that others can relate to, because it's an experience where someone else has probably felt the same thing. So there's a connectedness that comes through that. And then marketing strategy was the last part you touched on there. And that's sort of, it's a little bit more practical in the sense of how we're going to do things. So we've got a story. It's like, okay, where are our audience? Where do they spend their time? And then how do we tell that story in a contextual way? So whether that's in person, it could be at a basketball game and you have some media that comes to life in a basketball game. It could be on social media within that space. But the thing that marketing needs to do well is really understand what message is relevant to that person at that time. So it's very contextual, it's very considered, and obviously the world we live in now is changing at a rapid pace as far as digital experiences, how we connect with each other. So I think that's going to be a really interesting space to watch. Like the planner in me is very much going, okay, how do you get connection? How do you tell your story? And how does it land in a way that has effectiveness too, which is obviously for a startup really important. If you're spending your valuable dollars that you've either put in yourself or from an investor, you need to really rationalize that. So having a strong marketing plan gives you those foundations to be able to think through what does success look like, and then how do you drive that return.
Wow, thank you. That was like a master class in branding strategy. And look, we have Min Bagata joining us, and I have to thank you, Min, for joining us. You're always so awesome. And he put down, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it, right? And I'm just going to, yes, Min, you're absolutely right. That is so huge. And I think that's something we're really good at, making sure that we, take into account. And, I was just talking about this the other day, and you kind of were talking about this too, Andy, is that a lot of times, you talked about being transparent and being authentic. I think that's so important in all of that. It's like people value honesty, and we can easily tell when someone's being insincere in their brand, right? Or they're not being transparent. And so I think it's very important, because I remember when I first joined the studio, this was hard for me to wrap my head around. When I was talking about what we were doing, I could talk about my piece of what I'm doing as far as the journey goes. But it took me a while to really, take that brand and embody it, and really understand where Mark was coming from. And we had to have a lot of conversations where I was like, okay, now I'm ready to tell our story. It took me a while because I couldn't wrap my head around the story for a while. And so there are, that's what you're going to deal with when new people come in, whether they're founders or senior execs. You've got new people that come in. You want to make sure that they're able to tell the story effectively and represent the big brand. So talk to us about a little bit about how we go about doing that, Mark. I don't know, maybe you want to kick off that discussion on that.
Yeah, I think Andy touched on it, which is, I think I'll make it stark. I think when I started my career, people think of brand as a static thing, right? So you put a big think tank together, you decide what you stand for, you put the things on the wall, and that's our brand strategy, right? I think we're moving into a world where both people who buy from us, people who work with us, people who invest in us, they're looking for a dynamic relationship, and they can actually tell the difference between something that's static, that just was thought through and put on the wall, versus who you really are. And it'd be just similar, like, Facebook. Everybody's got their facade of, their life on Facebook, but you get to know people, and there's a lot more nuances and details, right? You can meet somebody as a potential recruit, and again, their narrative that you see on their resume or LinkedIn is one thing, but you have a chance to interact with them over time. You have a better understanding of where they might fit or their strengths and weaknesses. And I really do think that the future brand strategy is companies lean into that vulnerability, right? And people aren't going to just take your statements or your words on a wall or on a website. They want to feel you. They want to see that you're living those values. They want to see who you really, are, what you stand for. And that's going to come out in ways that you engage in social, the way you do things like this. It's one of the reasons why we've embraced this idea of the making of a nobody, is to just be really open about the things we've learned. And, we've had a few discussions where we talked about challenges that we had to overcome or adversity. And, I think that vulnerability you can hear from the team, the senior leadership, but really anybody across the studio. And you start to get a sense of what we stand for and who we are. And, this wasn't the case when we started the journey 4 years ago, but it happens a lot now that I get on calls and people are like, I've digested all your content. I've seen your guys' podcasts. I know what you guys stand for. They're referring to people like Min or you or Andy or Rob Vocalo or other people in the organization like they know them personally, but it's because they've digested our content. And it's like the conversations start at a different point. They've already decided that whatever we're vibrating, what we stand for, works for them. And the conversation, is at a different velocity. So, yeah, I would just say, again, make it stark for folks. Your grandfather's Oldsmobile, the old way of thinking of brand strategy was very static. And I think brand strategy now is very dynamic. But again, if you're not genuine, you're not doing things for the right reason, that's going to be hard for you.
Yeah. And I think it's important, right? Andy, and I'd love for you to talk about this, is how do we do that? How do we make sure that when new people come in, they know, they're familiar with the brand? Like when I have conversations with people now, I love that we're doing these live streams, because I tell them to go watch some of the live streams, right? And learn from, I say, watch our Chief Nobody will tell you what our core values mean. Do they resonate? with you, because this is what we're building into every part of our organization. So if one of our core values don't resonate with you, or you're not vibing with something, then that's okay. You want to know that. This is why we're doing it very openly, right? So Andy, what are some of the other pitfalls and advice that you have for startups as they're trying to sort of pass along, the brand to newbies, or other pitfalls they might be facing?
Yeah, for sure. I remember I started my first business in 2012, and we had a couple of interns in the early days. And then I remember getting into our first hiring process that we did. And it was quite interesting because as a young startup, you quite often have this sort of like tough spot where there's, in our instance, we were bootstrapping and we had limited money. It wasn't like we were deep. So from a payment point of view, like sometimes you can't pay the same amount, and there's things that you may need to do. And for young people who are taking a chance to work in a startup, in the sense of the old school traditional career path, there's a lot of factors involved with that. So I think for me, like we always looked at culture fit first, and going back to culture in the sense of if someone has enough of the skills to be able to do the job, culture is one of the key things that will either make or break that person, because if they believe in your purpose and your mission and they actually reflect the values already within that place, then that's always a perfect foundation to build off, because you have trust and they're always going to continue to support and amplify what your mission is and what you're doing. But when you get into the skills part, being able to train them is actually important too. So it's reciprocal in the way of like they feel like they're getting an experience where they're very hands-on, learning in a dynamic environment that can change across things. So it takes a certain type of person, and I think being able to, even before you hire them, find the right way to set that up in an interview process or something more casual potentially, where you get to know who that person is, and then that builds trust immediately. So for me, it's sort of like that's a great place to start, and then the training, but then also from a culture internally, how you retain that culture as you grow. It's one of the biggest challenges I think that a lot of startups go through, and I've got some good friends who did a 40 million Series A, and they now have teams and offices around the world, and it happened very quickly. And just listening to their story about how they tried to retain an element of what they were doing, and they're a big Australian startup and they have majority of their team now in the US. So immediately there's a culture sort of dynamic, which is quite different. And Mark and I laugh about this all the time between the two of us, just from some of the expressions we use in a really simple form. And I feel like I'm giving Mark some real alley-oops here, but I'm going to keep going before he interrupts. But I think that like those kind of things for me are they're benefits, but there's something to be aware of too, right? I think finding ways to connect with other team members is a beautiful thing, because you learn and you grow, you have different points of view as well. So leaning into difference is, again, one of the best things that you can get out of that experience. So I think it starts on being clear on who you are and what you stand for, then how you actually bring in the right people, and then how you nurture that. So that they're the 3 steps for me that I would use when thinking about value alignment and retaining culture.
Yeah, thank you. We've got the founder of Evalify, Mark just talked about, Nick, joining us, and he said your brand is the conversations, the stories people tell and sense. That's key, right? That feeling. It's very feeling oriented, which can make some people uncomfortable because it is that sense. Mark and I have talked about this on several occasions about you when you're not there, right? It's all in the nuances of perception and your audience's shared experiences. Yeah, thank you, Nick. And you're just doing an awesome job with Evalify. And we're so excited because this is a total game changer. And then somebody else added this true life. And I just want to get your both thoughts on this. It says, what is the relationship between talent and a contagious idea? Does any of you want to comment on that? And then before that, True Life put down the first 4 letters of culture tell the entire story. You need the cult of personality to create a brand.
Mark, do you want to have a go at that? I've definitely got.
Yeah, I like that. It's interesting. When was the first question was around what is the relationship between talent and contagious idea?
Yeah.
Well, I'll answer it the way I've talked about this before, and I touched on it earlier. One of the things you should do if you think you're onto something is you should start telling the story. And I say that because a lot of people get this wrong. And I've talked to a lot of founders I've been asked to be a part of or invest in or be an advisor or whatever. And it's like, they're 6-9 months into the path. And I'm like, okay, great. So who have you told? What customers have you talked to? And it's very easy to fall into this trap of I'm going to build it and then I'll go show people. Like people have this mentality, they want to have something to a certain state. I actually say the minute you can put a sentence together around an idea, you should start sharing it. Because what you know you're onto something when people start responding to it. You start to refine your message, you get better, your own thoughts become a little more synthesized, so you're more effective at communicating. But that's what I did with the studio. Thought about this for a little bit, and when I thought I had the core thesis, I just started reaching out to people that I fully expected half of them to tell me I was crazy, and it wasn't just picking friends and family or, my mom. I was reaching out to people expecting them to shoot holes in things. And when I saw the response was, no, I think you're onto something. In fact, I want to help. And you start to see the momentum build. So Contagious to me means there's something at the core idea that is resonating. And the only way to know that is to tell the story, no matter how raw you are or how early you are. So maybe to go back to the question, I do think you tell the story first. You refine your Contagious idea and make sure it's really resonating. And if you get that right, talent comes. People say, I want to be a part of that. I want to help. I want to play this role. And so talent comes, but you have to tell the story to know if you're onto something.
Yeah, Andy, do you want to add anything?
I think Mark nailed that for one. I think it's so perfect because it goes back to what I was saying before, that the people connect through stories. It's our genetic makeup, right? It's been happening for thousands and thousands of years. Our history is defined by storytelling, and that's how we connect. So people will find that and find their passion and their ability to be a part of something. And I'm a big believer in sharing stories early. And one of the things with strategy that you learn is that you never articulate your story in the right way the first time. It takes many iterations for it to make sense in your own head and resonate with someone else in the same way. So I think being able to explore and iterate on that is the way that you find the thing that ultimately connects a community of people. And I think for what Mark touched on there, which spoke to me too, is for nobody is our community and our crowd that we have are core to our business growth and our success, because we've got a whole group of people that are passionate about our mission that want to be able to connect that with more people. So you sort of have this ripple effect. So I think it goes back to that story and being open with sharing that very early.
Very gold. So we've got just a couple minutes left, but I definitely wanted to ask both of this. Mark started going there earlier, but looking to the future, right? What are some of the emerging trends that you both believe will shape brand strategy in the next 5 years?
Yeah, I said it earlier, and I'll reiterate it and let Andy grab it. But I do think that the most progressive brands will be very dynamic, very transparent. You won't feel like you're interacting with something static. You'll feel like you're part of the journey. You'll feel like you understand the people. People are buying into, do I want this product? Do I believe in the way these people think? Do I believe in the way they lead? Do I believe in what they stand for? And so I do believe that that transparency, I don't think there'll be many old brands that stick static that are going to transition, the next 10 or 20 years into relevancy. And I think the fastest growing brands you're going to see are going to be very transparent, very dynamic.
Yeah, and building on that too, I think for me, it's the environment that's going to change significantly as far as literally having a seat at the table, as far as how you build and retain relationships. It's not going to be this one-way approach of media, which is a little bit sort of spray and pray sort of mentality. And you think about people's passions for products, and going back to that sort of that cult piece that was called out before with the True Life piece. If you look at something like Liquid Death, and I talk about it a lot, and obviously it gets a lot of attention, it's in a category that is already cluttered and has built a business now that's doing, I think, close to $1 billion of annual sales. And the only difference is their brand and their storytelling, and people relate to that. But the way that they actually bring customers into that experience, there was a campaign that they did where someone said they'd rather lick the sweat off a sumo wrestler's back than drink the product as a way to track it down. So they ended up turning that into a taste test to get people, as part of a TV campaign, to do both, to lick the sweat off a sumo guy's back and then also taste the drink and see which one they like best. So it's sort of owning that conversation, it brings people close. So I think having that relationship combined with new environments that don't exist yet. If you think about Fortnite and the way that people communicate within a gaming platform now, where there's rivalry like you would having a five-a-side soccer competition with your friends, it's the same kind of thing. And that's an environment that didn't exist before. And we've seen live concerts happen in those things. Marshmallow did one, The Weeknd's done one. Like there's things that happen and just new ways. So I think that being part of this dynamic community is going to be fascinating, because that's at what humans seek out, is this connection. And for a brand, if you're not part of that conversation, then you're way behind the eight ball already.
Yeah, and thank you both. It's the conversation is definitely resonating. We have just a couple more comments I'm going to read. Ismail El Amin, I met him actually last week when I was in Chicago, and he said, I'm going to adapt the storyteller title. I loathe having to be a pushy salesperson, but I can tell all the stories with ease. And Ismail, I heard your story. He's doing some incredible work at starting his Found Up, and he told me the story. You're incredible, and I've already referred him to our website. Would love to see him come through the studio with his ideas, and maybe we can support what he's trying to do. And then Robert Vocala, great comment here. The brands that allow their customers and users and audience to immerse themselves into the brand's environment the most will ultimately win the culture and loyalty of those people. Absolutely. I think that both Mark and Andy, I know, agree with that. And then the last thing he added was, and those who listen the best to, listening is incredibly important. That's so true that Robert made that point. And I'm always amazed at our marketing folks, right? They're actively engaging with our audience regularly. I see, our team out on social media at events, talking about our story and talking about our brand. And this just sort of builds that community, right, of people, and it allows for that real-time feedback so that you can, pay attention, like you said, Robert, listen to the feedback, and then refine our brand strategy as we move forward. And especially for us, that becomes really important because we want to be irrationally global, right? So what might work in one country or city or state may not work somewhere else. So we can't just be so stuck in our brand strategy. We have to be willing to evolve. So we're at time. Does anybody want to add any last thoughts before we sign out for today?
One that I've been inspired by, just to share. Some of you guys might know the actress Katherine Heigl. I wouldn't say prior to this example I'm going to give you that I had a very strong opinion about her one way or the other. I just knew who she was, right? But she launched a product called Badlands Ranch, and it's pure, organic, healthy dog food. And if you go to that website, and you'll just read, and I didn't know this about her passion for dogs, her passion for animals, how much her animals are part of her life. She's rescued 20,000, pets over the course of the years. It's where she's put her foundational money and her nonprofit investments. And I don't know, someone that I didn't have necessarily a negative or a positive opinion about, I read that story and I immediately trusted her to give me food that would be good for my dog. And so I think it's just a great study for people to go listen to and watch and read, because it's an example of where I think brands are going. Very transparent, very heartfelt. In a very quick period, I trusted her and her decisions and her choices in terms of the food she's offered me, and I realize it's a commercial business. But again, I think that's the kind of relationship you need to create with your customers, and that what you need to be offering and your vulnerability and your why in terms of the future. So it's just a great use case.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Andy, any last words?
Hard to top that. That's a great story. He's just been sitting on that one waiting to throw it in.
He saved it the best for last.
Yeah, he did. I think that I'm obviously passionate about this, and the one thing that I would love everyone to think about is the word community. Community being internally and externally. I think that's the one, not quite silver bullet, but it's definitely the one thing that will make a huge difference in work culture and success from a marketing perspective as well. So I think if people focus on that and how to nurture that, they'll create themselves some successful businesses.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Mark and Andy, for sharing all of that wisdom with all of us. It was definitely resonating with all of our listeners. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Next week, we'll be back with a different topic, and we look forward to seeing you next week. If you've missed any of our prior episodes, you can find them on our YouTube channel at Nobody Crowd, and you might want to like and subscribe so you find out about our future episodes. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day, you guys.